Tonight, we are going to sit together in a medieval tavern and do absolutely nothing important. No kings will visit, no battles will be fought nearby, no one will make any decisions that history will remember. Instead, you will watch ordinary people finish an ordinary day in the most ordinary way possible, which is by sitting down, drinking ale that tastes like liquid bread, and talking about whether it might rain tomorrow. This is not the Middle Ages of castles and knights. This is the Middle Ages of sore backs and perpetual dampness and the small pleasure of being warm for an hour before walking home in the dark. We will observe a bailiff who would rather be sleeping, a serving woman who has mastered the art of carrying heavy things while avoiding drunk people, and several farmers debating topics they know nothing about with the confidence of experts. You do not need to do anything except listen. The tavern will do the rest. So settle in, let the day fall away, and prepare to spend an evening in a place where the most exciting thing that happens is someone winning at dice. You step through the low doorway as the last light fades from the western sky. The doorframe sits at precisely the height designed to remind tall people that medieval buildings were constructed by shorter, more practical individuals who saw no reason to waste good timber on extra headroom. The warmth inside spreads across your skin immediately. Though calling it warmth is generous when compared to actual heat. It is simply less cold than outside, which passes for luxury in 14th century England. Your eyes adjust to the interior, a process that takes longer than it should because the lighting budget for this establishment appears to have been 3 candles and whatever sunlight wanders in by accident. Tallow candles flicker in iron sconces along timber walls that have absorbed so much smoke over the years they have given up on being their original color. The walls are now simply dark, a shade that exists somewhere between brown and resignation. The air tells multiple stories at once, none of them particularly coordinated. Fresh baked bread announces itself with the confidence of something that knows it is the hero of this room. Ale adds its voice, sharp and insistent, reminding everyone that fermentation is technically controlled rot, and we have all made peace with this. Wet wool contributes an earthiness that no one asked for, but everyone must endure, because October in England means everything is damp and will remain damp until approximately July. Dried herbs dangle from ceiling beams in bunches that are either medicinal supplies or decorative choices, though in medieval terms these categories overlap considerably. You locate a wooden bench and sit, joining it in its weariness. The bench has been worn smooth by countless others, which is either a testament to craftsmanship or evidence that sitting is humanity's most practiced skill. The wood holds residual warmth from previous occupants, meaning you are essentially sitting in someone else's thermal echo. You accept this without question, because personal space is a concept that will not be invented for another few centuries. The tavern keeper moves behind a wooden counter that has seen more use than most pieces of furniture have any right to survive. He is a man whose face suggests he has heard every possible complaint about ale and has developed immunity to all of them. His apron bears stains that tell the story of his profession, though you choose not to read that story too carefully. He pours drinks with the mechanical efficiency of someone who has done this exact motion approximately 4,000 times and will do it 4,000 more before the week ends. A serving woman navigates the room with the precision of someone who has memorized every obstacle and can operate in near darkness while carrying liquids. She is young, probably 16, which in medieval terms means she's been working for a solid decade already. Her movements are economical and sure, wasting no energy on flourishes or unnecessary steps. She carries a clay pitcher that looks heavy enough to require both hands, yet she manages it with one while using the other to collect empty cups that previous patrons have abandoned in creative locations. She reaches your table and pours, without asking what you want, because what you want is irrelevant when there is only one thing available. The ale flows from pitcher to cup in a stream that looks like liquid bread, which is essentially what it is. Bits of grain float in it like confused swimmers. The cup itself is wooden, worn smooth on the rim where countless lips have touched it, which is either charming or deeply concerning depending on your tolerance for communal dining implements. You drink, because that is what one does with ale in a medieval tavern. The taste is thick and grainy, with a sweetness that suggests barley gave its life for this beverage and possibly had regrets. There is a slight sourness underneath, which is either a feature or a warning that fermentation is an imprecise science. You swallow and decide that generations of English peasants have survived on worse, so you probably will too. Around you, the tavern fills with the evening crowd. Workers arrive in clusters, bringing with them the evidence of their labor. Farmers carry the scent of livestock and turned earth. Craftsmen bear marks of their trades, ink on fingers for the scribe, sawdust in the hair of the carpenter, leather dust on the cobbler's sleeves. Everyone is tired in that particular way that comes from doing the same difficult work in the same difficult way that your grandfather did and his grandfather before him. The social geography of the tavern reveals itself slowly. The benches nearest the fire belong to those who arrived earliest or who command the most respect, which in a medieval village often amounts to the same thing. The bailiff sits there, a man whose job involves collecting rents and enforcing manor rules, making him universally necessary and moderately resented. Next to him sits the reeve, elected by his fellow villagers to manage the lord's land, which means he occupies the uncomfortable position of representing both the workers and the master. They nod at each other with the warmth of two people who must cooperate professionally but would not choose each other's company otherwise. Further from the fire, younger workers claim their spaces. Three men who spent the day repairing fences sit together, their hands still bearing fresh scratches from hawthorn hedges. They speak in the particular rhythm of people who have worked side by side all day, and therefore have already exhausted most conversational topics, but continue talking anyway, because silence feels too much like more work. One mentions that the hedge along the eastern field keeps growing back wrong, coming in thick where it should be sparse, and sparse where it should be thick, as if the hawthorn has personal opinions about fence construction. Another agrees, adding that his father always believed hawthorn was a contrary plant, though his father also believed that talking to plants improved their growth, so his horticultural opinions may require scrutiny. The third man contributes nothing but nods, having apparently reached his word limit for the day. At another table, two women sit with the specific posture of people who have been on their feet since before dawn and have only recently remembered that sitting is possible. One is the baker's wife, recognizable by the flour that has permanently settled into the creases of her hands and the faint scent of yeast that follows her like a devoted pet. The other works in the manor house, which you can tell by the way she sits slightly straighter, as if the lady of the manor might walk in at any moment and judge her posture. They share bread and cheese with the reverence of people who know exactly how much labor went into producing both. The conversation between them moves through topics like a river finding its path. They discuss children first because children are always either ill, causing trouble, or both. The baker's wife mentions that her youngest has developed a cough that sounds like a crow arguing with itself. The manor workers counter with a story about her daughter who has decided that shoes are optional, even in October, because 6-year-olds are philosophers who have transcended practical concerns like cold feet. From there, they move to the topic of husbands, which they approach with the fond exasperation of people discussing beloved but occasionally bewildering animals. Apparently, the baker has strong opinions about how bread should be kneaded, but cannot locate his own shoes without assistance. The manor worker's husband can repair any tool in the village, but believes that washing is a seasonal activity, like planting or harvest. The serving woman returns to refill cups, moving through the tavern like water through stones, finding the path of least resistance. She exchanges brief words with the baker's wife, something about an order for tomorrow, and receives a nod in response. The transaction takes perhaps 5 seconds and contains an entire conversation about quantity, timing, and payment that both parties understand perfectly without stating explicitly. This is the efficiency of people who have conducted the same business for years and have eliminated all unnecessary words. Near the back of the tavern, a group of younger men have started a game of dice, which is technically illegal under laws that prefer people to practice archery in their spare time rather than gambling. The tavern keeper glances at them with the expression of someone who has decided that this particular law is someone else's problem,
possibly the bailiff's, who is currently absorbed in his ale and showing no interest in law enforcement. The dice clatter against the wooden table with sounds like small bones, which is appropriate because that is exactly what they are made from. Sheep knuckle bones, cleaned and carved, now serving as instruments of chance and poor decision-making. The young men bet in small stakes, trading promises and minor favors rather than actual currency, because actual currency is a rare and precious thing best saved for necessities, like grain or the occasional bribe. One owes another a day's help with plowing, another has promised to repair a roof. A third appears to be wagering his sister's baking skills, which seems ethically questionable but goes unchallenged by the group. Their laughter rises above the general murmur of conversation, the particular kind of laughter that comes from young men who have finished a day's work and have not yet developed the bone-deep weariness that will characterize their later years. They still believe, in some fundamental way, that life might surprise them. Give them another decade and they will settle into the same resigned contentment as their fathers, but for now they laugh too loud and believe too much in their own luck. An older man sits alone near the corner, nursing his cup with the slow dedication of someone making it last. His clothes mark him as a laborer, but his hands tell a more specific story. They are gnarled and scarred in ways that suggest a lifetime of particular work, probably with stone. A mason, then, or perhaps someone who has spent decades repairing walls and wells. He watches the room without apparent interest, his face holding the neutral expression of someone who has seen enough of life to know that most of it is repetitive, and some of it is briefly interesting, and very little of it is worth getting excited about. The tavern keeper's wife emerges from the back room carrying a large pot that steams with promise. She is a substantial woman, built for endurance rather than speed, with forearms that suggest she has spent considerable time kneading, stirring, and lifting heavy things. She sets the pot near the fire and begins ladling its contents into wooden bowls. The smell intensifies, a thick portage of grain and vegetables and possibly meat, though the meat is more theoretical than actual, existing as a rumor of flavor rather than visible chunks. Those who want food make their requests known through a system of nods and raised fingers. The serving woman collects bowls and distributes them with the same efficient navigation she applies to everything else. You receive yours and examine its contents. The portage is thick enough to support a spoon vertically, which is either impressive or concerning. Bits of barley float alongside what might be turnip or might be parsnip or might be anything pale and root-like. You eat because you are hungry and because the alternative is not eating, which seems worse. The meal is aggressively adequate. It is hot and filling and tastes of salt and grain and the optimistic addition of herbs that are trying their best. You have eaten better and you have certainly eaten worse, and this meal settles somewhere in the vast middle ground of human cuisine that keeps people alive without inspiring poetry. As you eat, the tavern's rhythm becomes more apparent. People arrive in waves corresponding to when their work ends. The craftsmen came first, finished with their daylight-dependent labor. The field workers arrived next, released when the sun made further work impossible. Now the last stragglers appear, those whose work continues into evening or who had additional tasks that kept them late. A shepherd arrives smelling of lanolin and outdoor air. A man who works the night watch comes in for ale before beginning his shift, which seems counterproductive but is apparently traditional. The conversation in the room creates a sound like a river, constant and varying, with individual voices rising and falling within the general flow. The bailiff holds forth on the topic of next month's court session, where various local disputes will be settled and fines will be levied, and everyone will pretend that justice is being served rather than simply expedience and tradition. His companion listens with the attention of someone who is physically present but mentally planning tomorrow's tasks. The women near you have moved on to discussing remedies and recipes, those two categories blending together in medieval life, where the line between food and medicine is more suggestion than boundary. Someone's child has worms, a common enough problem that the discussion treats it with the same gravity as discussing which saint's day falls next week. Garlic is recommended, both eaten and worn in a pouch around the neck, because if a remedy is worth doing, it is worth doing redundantly. Someone else suggests a tonic of rue and wormwood, which sounds less like medicine and more like the ingredients for summoning something unfortunate. The fire pops and settles, sending up a small shower of sparks that die before reaching the ceiling. Someone has fed it another log, and it accepts this offering with temporary enthusiasm before returning to its steady work of converting wood into heat and light. The flames create moving shadows on the walls, turning the tavern into a space that seems to breathe with its own life. A traveling merchant sits near the fire, recognizable by his better quality clothes and the leather satchel he keeps close to his body at all times. He is either brave or foolish to be traveling these roads in autumn, when bandits are hungry and desperate, and the king's law extends only as far as the king's soldiers, which is not particularly far at all. He nurses his ale and keeps his conversation minimal, a smart choice, given that talking too much about one's business invites questions about one's wealth, which invites interest from exactly the wrong sort of people.
The tavern keeper appears to know everyone by sight if not by name, nodding at arrivals and marking in his memory who is paid and who is promised to pay, and who needs watching because their promises are unreliable. He maintains order through presence rather than action, his substantial build and neutral expression suggesting that causing trouble would be more effort than it is worth. The serving woman appears to be his daughter, sharing his practical build and efficient movements, learning the family business through the traditional method of doing it constantly until it becomes automatic. 2 monks enter the tavern, their brown robes and tonsured heads marking them as clearly as any uniform. They are traveling between monasteries, probably carrying letters or documents or news of church business. The tavern keeper greets them with slightly more deference than he shows others, because upsetting monks is bad for business and possibly bad for one's immortal soul, and it is better to avoid both problems simultaneously. The monks sit and accept ale, because monks are permitted ale and generally consume it in quantities that suggest they consider it one of the better aspects of earthly existence. They speak quietly between themselves in Latin, which effectively prevents anyone else from understanding their conversation, though whether they are discussing theology or complaining about the quality of monastery food remains unclear. Their presence shifts the room's atmosphere slightly. Conversations continue, but voices lower fractionally, and the dice game in the back becomes more subtle, the players keeping the bones cupped in their hands rather than throwing them openly. This is not because anyone expects the monks to object, but because there is a general sense that religious figures should be protected from seeing too much of regular human behavior, like sheltering children from knowledge they will inevitably acquire anyway. The evening deepens and the candles burn lower, their flames guttering in drafts that slip through gaps in the walls that no amount of daub and wattle completely seals. The temperature in the tavern exists in layers, warm near the fire, cool by the walls, cold near the door whenever someone enters or leaves. You have positioned yourself in the middle zone, neither roasting nor freezing, which is the best most medieval experiences can offer. A man with a lute enters, and the tavern keeper's expression suggests this is a regular occurrence that he tolerates rather than encourages. The musician is thin in the way of people whose profession does not involve regular meals, and his instrument has seen better days, its wood worn smooth and its strings replaced so many times that the original lute is more philosophical concept than physical reality. He settles himself on a stool near the fire and begins tuning, a process that takes longer than seems necessary and produces sounds that make several people wince. Eventually, he begins playing, and the room settles into listening, or at least into not talking loudly enough to drown him out. The song is one of those ballads about knights and ladies and dragons, the kind of story that bears no resemblance to anyone's actual life, but which people enjoy anyway because imagining impossible things is one of humanity's more harmless pastimes. His voice is adequate rather than exceptional, but he commits to the performance with the dedication of someone who knows that enthusiasm can compensate for technical limitations. Between verses, he stops to drink ale that someone has provided, because paying musicians with alcohol is traditional and convenient and saves the bother of actual money. He launches into another song, this one about a miller's daughter and a nobleman, which has the structure of a moral tale and the content of something considerably less moral.
The audience appreciates it with the knowing laughter of people who understand exactly what is being implied without it being stated explicitly. The shepherd who arrived earlier has fallen asleep in his corner, his head tilted back against the wall and his mouth open in an expression of complete surrender to exhaustion. No one disturbs him, because sleeping in taverns is accepted practice for those too tired to make it home or too far from home to try. The tavern keeper will likely let him stay until closing, then wake him with the gentle firmness of someone removing an obstacle. The women near you have been joined by a third, who brings news from the manor house that apparently the lady's sister is visiting, which means extra work for everyone involved in feeding and housing nobility. The manor worker groans softly because visiting nobility means standards must be higher and tempers will be shorter, and someone will inevitably be blamed when things go wrong, and that someone is usually whoever is standing closest when the lady becomes displeased.
They discuss strategies for surviving the visit with the tactical precision of generals planning a campaign. Extra help will be needed for laundry. The cook will be impossible to work with, but someone must check that he is not drinking the good wine and replacing it with cheaper stuff, because he has done this before and will do it again if left unsupervised. Someone's daughter who is good with hair must be borrowed to help with the visiting lady's elaborate braiding requirements, because apparently nobility cannot simply tie their hair back like reasonable people, but must involve 3 hours and 4 hands in the process. The conversation makes you grateful that your own labor involves dirt and animals and straightforward physical work, rather than the complex social navigation required of those who serve in manor houses. Sheep do not care about elaborate braiding or the correct way to serve wine. They simply need grass and water, and occasionally someone to pull them out of situations they have gotten themselves into through sheep-like logic. The dice game in the back has concluded, apparently with mixed results judging by the expressions of the players. The winner collects his promises with the satisfaction of someone who has beaten the odds, while the losers accept their fate with the resignation of people who knew gambling was involved and chose to participate anyway. They return to drinking, the game's conclusion removing the need for quiet and allowing them to resume normal conversation volume. One of the younger men starts telling a story about a strange occurrence in the North Field, where apparently stones have been moving of their own accord, rearranging themselves overnight. His companions listen with expressions of polite skepticism. One suggests badgers, another proposes that someone is playing pranks. The storyteller insists that the stones are too large for badgers and too heavy for pranks, leaving only supernatural explanations, which he delivers with the enthusiasm of someone who wants very much to believe in something more interesting than ordinary life. His audience remains unconvinced, but allows him his story, because everyone deserves the occasional moment of believing they have witnessed something mysterious. The older mason in the corner makes a sound that might be a laugh or might be a cough, but which clearly expresses his opinion on the supernatural stone theory. Stones move when frost heaves them, or when water undermines them, or when some idiot decides to move them and forgets to mention it, not because of fairies or spirits or whatever the young man is implying. The tavern keeper begins the slow process of signaling that closing time approaches. He does this not through announcements, but through subtle changes in behavior. He stops refilling cups quite so readily. He begins wiping down surfaces that do not strictly need wiping. He makes slightly more noise than necessary when moving barrels and shifting benches. The regular patrons recognize these signs and begin the process of finishing their drinks and preparing to leave. The monks depart first, nodding their thanks and disappearing into the darkness outside with the confidence of people who believe divine protection will see them safely to their lodging. The merchant follows shortly after, clutching his satchel and glancing around with the wariness of someone carrying something valuable through uncertain streets. Several of the field workers rise and stretch, their joints creaking audibly after hours of sitting following hours of laboring. The 2 women near you gather their things, wrapping shawls tighter against the cold outside. They continue their conversation, even as they prepare to leave, discussing tomorrow's tasks with the weary inevitability of people who know that morning will come regardless of whether they are ready for it. The baker's wife reminds the other about the bread order. The manor worker promises to send her daughter over to help with the baking in exchange for some of the results. The lute player finishes his final song and packs his instrument with careful attention to its fragile state. Someone has left him a heel of bread and some cheese, payment for his entertainment, which he accepts with a small bow that maintains his dignity while acknowledging the essential transaction. He too departs into the night, heading to whatever accommodation he has arranged or to find shelter under someone's shed if he has arranged nothing. The shepherd in the corner wakes with a snort when the cavern keeper taps his shoulder. He blinks in confusion, momentarily uncertain where he is or how he arrived there, then remembers and rises with the stiffness of someone whose body has settled into position and resents being asked to move. He mumbles something that might be thanks or might be complaint and shuffles toward the door, his gait suggesting that the distance between tavern and home is one he can navigate by memory alone, which is fortunate given the darkness and his evident disorientation. You remain seated as the tavern empties, watching the transformation from busy common room to quiet space. The serving woman collects abandoned cups and bowls, stacking them efficiently for tomorrow's washing. The tavern keeper banks the fire, covering the coals with ash to preserve them through the night so tomorrow's fire will start more easily. His wife sweeps the floor with broad strokes that push rushes and dropped food and general debris toward the door, where it will be dealt with in the morning. The candles have burned very low now, some guttering out entirely, others reduced to small stubs that will not last much longer. The darkness gathers in the corners of the room, waiting to reclaim the space once the last lights fail. The temperature drops noticeably as the fire settles to coals, and you can feel the cold pressing in from outside, patient and persistent. The few remaining patrons finish their drinks and make their departures, each leaving the warmth with visible reluctance. The tavern keeper nods to each, his expression neutral but not unfriendly, the look of someone who has done his job adequately and expects no particular recognition from meeting basic expectations. His wife continues her cleaning with the methodical attention of someone who has done this exact task every night for more years than she cares to count. You rise from your bench, feeling the stiffness in your own joints from sitting after a day of movement. Your legs remember the work they did earlier, digging or plowing or walking behind livestock, and they inform you through various aches that they would prefer to continue resting. You ignore them, because ignoring your body's complaints is a fundamental skill of medieval existence. The tavern keeper accepts your nod of farewell with one of his own. No words are exchanged because none are necessary. You have occupied his space, consumed his ale, contributed to his evening's business, and are now leaving. This transaction needs no further discussion. The serving woman is already wiping down the bench you vacated, returning it to readiness for tomorrow's occupants. You step toward the door, leaving the diminished warmth of the tavern behind. The change in temperature is immediate and comprehensive. The October night air hits you with the enthusiasm of something that has been waiting for this exact moment. Your breath becomes visible, small clouds that dissipate quickly into the darkness. The sky above is clear and filled with more stars than you ever see in summer, when warmth and humidity blur the heavens. The village around you is dark and quiet. Most households have already settled for the night, their fires banked, their inhabitants wrapped in whatever blankets and furs they possess. A dog barks somewhere in the distance, a sound that carries clearly in the still air. Another dog answers, and then silence returns, deeper than before. The path beneath your feet is familiar enough that you navigate it more by memory than sight. You know where the ruts are, where the path narrows, where someone's fence extends slightly into the common way. Your feet find these features automatically, while your mind drifts through the evening's observations, the conversations you overheard, the faces you saw, the small dramas and mundane concerns of people whose lives intersect with yours in this small community where everyone knows everyone and privacy is a luxury no one can afford. Above you, the stars continue their slow rotation, indifferent to human concerns about harvests and health and the price of grain. They look down on ancient Rome, and they will look down on whatever comes after medieval England, unchanging and remote. This thought is either comforting or troubling, depending on your mood, and tonight you are too tired to decide which. You reach your dwelling,
a structure that serves as home through the generous definition medieval life applies to such terms. It keeps out most of the rain and some of the wind, and provides a space to sleep that is marginally warmer than being outside. These modest achievements make it valuable beyond any monetary measure, because shelter is the difference between surviving winter and not surviving winter, and that difference matters more than comfort or beauty or any other consideration. Inside, darkness is complete. You navigate by touch and memory, finding your sleeping space among whichever family members or livestock share this building with you. The straw beneath you rustles as you settle, and the rough wool of your blanket scratches against your skin. These minor discomforts barely register. You're horizontal, you are sheltered, and you are done with today's labor. Sleep comes quickly, as it always does for those who work physically from dawn to dusk. Your last conscious thought is probably not profound. Perhaps you remember that tomorrow the hedge needs finishing. Perhaps you worry briefly about whether the cow's cough is serious. Perhaps you think nothing at all, simply surrendering to the exhaustion that claims you every night. The tavern, back along the path you just walked, stands quiet now. The tavern keeper and his family have retired to their own quarters, above or behind the common room. The fire breathes softly under its blanket of ash. The benches wait in patient rows for tomorrow's occupants. Outside, the village sleeps under its blanket of stars, and the October night continues its slow progress toward dawn. In a few hours, roosters will announce the sun's return. Fires will be rebuilt from preserved coals. People will rise and dress and begin again the endless cycle of work that defines their existence. The tavern will open its door to those seeking breakfast ale. The serving woman will begin her rounds. The tavern keeper will take his position behind his counter. And the whole pattern will repeat as it has repeated for generations, as it will repeat for generations more. But for now, there is only darkness and quiet and rest. The evening you spent in the tavern, surrounded by neighbors and strangers, consuming adequate ale and acceptable food, listening to conversations about weather and children and remedies and work, fades into memory even as you experience it. It was not a remarkable evening. Nothing extraordinary occurred. No one said anything particularly clever or did anything especially noteworthy. It was simply an evening in a medieval tavern, one of thousands such evenings, filled with ordinary people doing ordinary things, surviving another day in lives that consist mostly of survival. The warmth of the fire, the taste of the ale, the sound of voices blending into companionable noise, these small comforts matter precisely because they are small and because they are available. They make the hardness of medieval life fractionally less hard, and that fraction is worth the walk through cold darkness to obtain it.
Tomorrow you will work again. Your body will ache again. The weather will cooperate or not cooperate with whatever task requires completion. Someone will need something from you, and you will need something from someone else, and the complex web of interdependence that defines village life will continue binding everyone together in relationships of necessity and familiarity and occasional genuine affection. But tomorrow is not yet here. For now, there is sleep, deep and dreamless, the sleep of people too tired for their unconscious minds to bother with elaborate scenarios. And in the morning, when you wake to another day of labor, you will probably not remember much about the evening you spent in the tavern. It will blur together with all the other evenings, becoming part of the general texture of life rather than a distinct memory. This is not sad. This is simply how ordinary life works. Most moments pass without being recorded or remembered or considered significant. They happen, they end, and they are replaced by new moments that will also pass unremarked. The history that gets written down is about kings and battles and treaties, but the history that gets lived is about taverns and ale and conversations about whether rain will come tomorrow. You lived a small piece of that unwritten history tonight. You occupied a bench that hundreds have occupied before you and hundreds will occupy after you. You drank ale made from grain that grew in fields you probably helped plant. You breathed air warmed by a fire that has burned in that same hearth for years. You existed in a space that exists for exactly this purpose, to
provide a brief respite from the unending demands of survival. And now you sleep, joining the rest of the village in the collective surrender to exhaustion that happens every night. The stars continue overhead. The October wind moves through bare branches. The tavern stands quiet in the darkness, and life, ordinary medieval life, pauses until dawn brings it all around again. The evening is over. The warmth of the tavern has faded from your skin. The taste of ale has faded from your mouth. The voices and laughter have faded into silence. What remains is the simple fact of your continued existence. One more day survived, one more evening spent in the company of others who were surviving alongside you. In the grand scope of history, this evening matters not at all. In the smaller scope of your life, it matters only as one data point among thousands, a Tuesday night in autumn in a year you probably cannot name. But in the immediate scope of experience, it mattered enough. It was warm when you were cold, it was company when you were alone, it was rest when you were tired. That is enough. It has always been enough. And as you drift into sleep, your body already preparing itself for tomorrow's work, the memory of the evening settles into its proper place among all the other ordinary evenings, neither more nor less significant than any of them, simply one more small piece of a life made up entirely of small pieces. The tavern will be there tomorrow night. The ale will taste the same. The conversations will cover the same topics with minor variations. The fire will warm the same space, and you will likely go again because that is what one does. You work all day, and then you seek a brief moment of warmth and company before sleeping and working again. This is medieval life in its most essential form, not the grand events of history, but the small rhythms of ordinary existence. The tavern, the ale, the conversation, the walk home through darkness, the collapse into sleep. Repeated endlessly, varied slightly, endured completely. And somehow, inexplicably, it is enough to build a life on. Not a life of comfort or ease or beauty, but a life nonetheless. One tavern evening at a time, one day's work at a time, one small moment of warmth at a time. Added together, these moments create something that resembles meaning, or at least resembles the pattern of a life lived. The evening ends as all evenings end, in darkness and silence and sleep. Tomorrow will begin as all tomorrows begin, with light returning and work resuming and the whole cycle starting again. But that is tomorrow's concern. Tonight there was only rest and the fading memory of warmth and the certain knowledge that the tavern will be there again when you need it.
Which will be tomorrow night, most likely, because some needs are consistent across time and circumstance. The need for warmth, the need for company, the need for a space that exists outside the demands of work and survival, if only for an hour or two. The tavern provides these things, imperfectly but reliably, and that reliability makes it worth the cold walk through October darkness. Sleep deepens. The night progresses. The world continues turning. And in a medieval village in 14th century England, in a tavern that will stand for another 200 years before fire claims it, in a life that history will never record, an ordinary evening concludes in the most ordinary way possible. With sleep, with rest, with the simple biological process of a body recovering from labor so it can perform more labor tomorrow. Nothing dramatic, nothing remarkable, just the basic mechanics of existence, playing out as they have played out for countless generations and will play out for countless more. The evening in the tavern is over. This moment passes into the past, joining all the other past moments, becoming nothing more than the faintest memory of warmth and ale and voices in the darkness. And that is enough. It was always enough. It will always be enough. Sleep well. Tomorrow brings more work, but tonight brought a tavern and warmth and the company of others. That is all anyone can reasonably expect from a Tuesday evening in medieval England. That is all anyone ever gets.